What are you doing? What are you doing?
That's an oarfish.
The other reason we're talking about the deep sea is that a paper's just come out about the extent of the seabed that has been mapped.
Yeah, I was quite surprised by this. It's the finding that 99.999% of the deep seabed is unexplored. And Maddie Cuff is here to talk about this. Maddie.
Yes, so all of those deep-sea submersibles that we've been sending down into the ocean for decades, turns out we've hardly explored any of the deep ocean.
I mean, I guess to be fair, it's quite big, quite difficult to get to.
Yeah, so we have scanned some of the deep seabed with radar and satellites, but we're talking here about really directly observing it. So sending down deep sea submersibles to either see it with our own eyes or to send cameras down there. And it really is a vast area. Around 71% of the Earth's total surface area is seafloor. And of this ocean area, around 93% of it is deep seafloor, which is classed as seabed that's deeper than 200 metres. Now, researchers have combed through nearly 44,000 records of deep submergence activities, so these kind of deep dive submersibles. And yeah, they found that, as you say, only 0.001% of the deep seabed has been seen with human eyes.
That's amazing if you think about what we have actually seen, things like, these incredible hydrothermal vents, for example.
Yeah, so we've made some really extraordinary discoveries in that tiny fraction that we have seen. So hydrothermal vents are a great example. They were first discovered in 1977 near the Galapagos Islands by the deep sea submersible Alvin. And it's because of that discovery that we know that entire deep sea ecosystems can be sustained in darkness and feeding off this hot mineral-rich water that comes out of the seafloor. And we had really no idea that this whole ecosystem could exist before we saw them with our own eyes.
And that's even sort of fed into how we think about how life might have started on Earth, right? So it's not just about understanding the deep. It has much wider implications for how we think about life.
Exactly. It's one of those kind of classic cases of we don't know what we don't know until we find it. Another major discovery is, of course, these nodule fields. So there's the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is part of the Pacific Ocean. And that's this abyssal seafloor that's littered with these metallic nodules that people now want to mine for their materials. We only know about places like the Clarion-Clipperton Zone because of deep-sea exploration in the 1950s.
Yeah, so I just assumed nodules were something recent because of all the recent fuss over them. But I just read they were discovered by HMS Challenger in the 1870s.
No, I didn't know that.
1870s.
Challenger.
Yeah.
That was a really famous expedition, wasn't it? The first global marine
Yeah, Royal
project.
Society changed a naval vessel and did this amazing expedition. The Space Shuttle Challenger was named after that as well, by the way.
So, Maddie, then, the nodules, the controversial nodules.
Yeah, as Rowan says, we've known about these nodules for decades, but it's only been in the last few years, as the energy transition has ramped up, that interest in kind of getting our hands on these for the materials that they contain has really intensified. So this debate about whether to dig these nodules up off the seafloor, and if so, how, has been rumbling on for years. Mining firms say that we can scoop them up quite easily and that it would be a great way of getting the materials like cobalt and nickel that we need for things like electric vehicle batteries, for example. And the argument is that it's better to get these nodules from the seabed than, say, establishing a new mine in the middle of the rainforest, for example.
Which I've had a lot of sympathy for that argument, actually.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that is kind of running into a bit of problems as we learn more about how extraordinary life in the deep sea can be, and as we explore more of this kind of unseen space and understand more about how these ecosystems work. The negotiations themselves have really been in deadlock because it's very difficult to prove that you won't have a detrimental environmental impact on this, what is actually a pristine ecosystem in the deep ocean. Nations have been debating for years about whether to allow deep sea mining, and if so, what would be the rules that would govern this industry. And essentially the talks are kind of in deadlock between countries that want to go ahead with this and countries that don't. And Rowan mentioned at the start of this section that President Trump has kind of put a rocket under that debate by releasing this executive order that essentially says that the US would allow deep sea mining both in its own national waters and in international waters. So that could potentially supersede the authority that countries collectively would have to agree whether or not to press ahead with this.
And we saw a reaction to that within days, right?
Yeah, a company called the Metals Company, which is one of the leading firms wanting to do this deep sea mining, has already submitted a permit application to the US government to ask if it can do it in international waters. So I think within 3 months they'll have to give an answer about whether or not they're going to press ahead, and it looks likely that the Trump administration will allow it. But it's worth saying that there are growing questions over whether or not we even need to mine the seabed for these metals.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And so to learn more about this, I spoke to Dustin Mulvaney, and he's a professor of environmental studies at San Jose State University, and he's the author of a book called Sustainable Energy Transitions. So he's the perfect person to talk to. Here he is.
According to some trends in battery technologies, the idea that we need to go mine the deep sea urgently to get these metals seems incredibly misplaced. We are already seeing battery manufacturers move away from those rare nickel, cobalt, and manganese elements in battery technologies. We are seeing an increase in the iron phosphate batteries, for example. We are starting to see sodium-based batteries that don't require any of those elements. And we don't know what the future holds. 10 years from now, we might be talking about different elements. We could get increasing amounts of those supplies from existing mines. We can get increasing amounts of some of those materials from tailings piles and other waste from mining sites. And it's also the case that we landfill in the United States specifically about as much copper as we demand for industrial production and other things like that. So we are literally letting copper go to landfill while we're proposing new deep sea mining, and that just seems incredibly unfortunate situation to be in.
Yeah, so it's worth remembering here that getting any meaningful supplies from the deep sea is likely to take decades. And so it might be that new battery technology comes to the rescue before the mining industry gets to scale.
I'm thrilled about this because for years it feels like there's been this message that if you care about climate change and you want to see economies decarbonise, you just have to accept digging up the seafloor. But actually the tech is moving on and that might not be true.
Yeah, and like Dustin says, we need to be much smarter about how we manage the materials that we've already got. And it's clear that there are some real gains to be made in resource efficiency that probably we should look at first before sending our mining equipment down to the deep ocean.
Yeah, and then, of course, there's the ecological context as well. And so I spoke to marine biologist and author Olive Heffernan about this. Olive's written a brilliant book called The High Seas, Ambition, Power and Greed on the Unclaimed Oceans. And here she is.
So life in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone really begins with the nodules. The nodules might look like lifeless rocks, but in fact they're anything but. They are a vital habitat in an environment that is otherwise soft and muddy. They provide these hard substrates for tiny organisms such as microbes and sponges to come and settle on, and that in turn attracts larger organisms. For example, octopuses come and lay their eggs in the sponges, and over time this builds up very vibrant, diverse communities, all reliant on the nodules. But it turns out the nodules are actually more than just a substrate. So last year, scientists released a study that showed that the nodules themselves are actually producing oxygen in the dark, deep ocean. And that is a fascinating discovery. It suggests that they are sustaining these communities and that they could be giving an important energy source to deep sea life. And you know, what's also interesting is just the extent of how little we still know about what lives down there. So scientists over the last few years who've been conducting surveys of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone have found that 90% of the species that they're hauling up are entirely new to science, never seen before by anyone on Earth. In 2023, for example, there was one study from an untouched area that identified 5,000 previously unseen life forms. And there were some weird and wonderful creatures in there. Two of my favorites were the gummy squirrel, it's like a sea cucumber that's like a cross between a shoe and a banana. And the other was the ping pong tree sponge, which is like a sort of strange carnivorous seafloor dweller. So, all of this is incredibly exciting science, but it also suggests that it would be easy for mining to wipe out one or many of these species without anyone even realizing.
Amazing. So, Maddie, last year you reported on that discovery for us that there might be dark oxygen produced by these nodules, and that was kind of world-changing news. But I had no idea actually that this is a habitat to all these weird and crazy gummy squirrels, ping-pong tree sponges. These are good names.
And the only reason we know about these things is because the Clarion-Clipperton Zone is one of the few international zones that is being explored by deep-sea submersibles because it's of economic interest, right? There's plenty of other areas of international waters that simply haven't had any attention paid to them, so who knows what's down there.
Now, we're recording this on David Attenborough's 99th birthday. Happy birthday, Sir David. He has a new book out and a new film called Ocean, Earth's Last Wilderness. And he says about deep-sea mining, if you were to protect areas of the deep ocean, then how would you decide where to do so? Which really goes back to your story, Maddie, about we only know 0.001% of the ocean floor. And in the book, he quotes Jessica Battle, who runs the No Deep Seabed Mining Initiative at WWF. And she's an ocean governance and policy expert. And she says that even the trawling industry opposes deep-sea mining. So I asked her for her thoughts, and here she is.
Public opposition to deep-sea mining is increasing globally across various sectors. 32 countries, including Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, along with numerous legislators and parliamentarians and civil society groups, and importantly, Pacific indigenous communities, have all called for a pause or moratorium on deep-sea mining. Add to this, over 800 ocean scientists stand behind a call to pause deep-sea mining until the deep sea is better mapped and understood. Only then can decisions around opening this industry be taken in good faith. Major businesses such as Apple, Volvo, BMW and Samsung, as well as investors such as Deutsche Bank and others, and insurers like Swiss Re and Hannover Re, have all pledged to avoid involvement in this industry. Even big groups in the fishing industry has called for a pause on deep seabed mining. The Global Tuna Alliance did so a couple of years ago, and the European Fisheries Advisory Councils have done so too. The risks to the ocean, to ocean-dependent communities and industries are too large to ignore.